Hi, everybody. I want to thank you all so much for coming to my talk about the business of being indie. I'm sorry we had a few technical difficulties, so thanks for being patient. Hopefully it gave you a little time to get to know each other. I'm really excited to be here today. Thank you so much for having me. Melbourne is pretty much my favorite city in the world. I actually was an exchange student here a long time ago. I went to high school in Melbourne, longer ago than I will admit to a room full of people I don't know. And if I could move here tomorrow, I totally would, which next week, if Trump gets elected, I might have to. So if anybody has a couch I can live on for, say, the next 4 years, come see me after, because that's some scary shit right there. So anyway, my name is Amy Dallas. I am one of the co-founders of Clutch Play Games out of Portland, Oregon. And I'm also on the board of directors of OGO, which is the Oregon Games Organization. I'll talk about OGO in a minute, but let's start off with a little background on Clutch Play. So Clutch Play's been around for about 5 years, and like a lot of indie studios, we divide our time between doing work for hire and developing our own IP. So we didn't actually plan it that way. Of course, like a lot of indies, we thought, oh, we're going to make great games, we're going to live like rock stars, and that, of course, doesn't always work out. In fact, it rarely works out. So in terms of our own games, we have two. The first one is a game called Little Chomp, which I often refer to as our indie starter pancake. And I don't know if starter pancake is a term you use here, because to your credit, I think as a nation, you eat a lot less pancakes than we do in the United States. But the starter pancake is basically the wonky, sad pancake that should turn out well, but it just doesn't. It tastes good, but it's just a mess, so you throw it away. So that was actually Little Chomp. We learned a lot of really expensive lessons on that game. And the beneficiary of all the lessons we learned was our second game, Skullduggery. So Skullduggery got a lot of love from Apple, which certainly helped us quite a bit. In fact, they featured us in the Halloween sale over the weekend. And we were also in the PAX 10 at PAX Prime a couple summers ago with a very cool developer here in Melbourne, Comobius, who I'm sure a lot of you guys know. But as far as being a full-service studio, we actually have been doing a lot more of that in the last couple of years, because that's worked out pretty well for us. And in terms of the clients that we have, it's funny, when you consult, there are clients who will let you talk about them, and some you cannot talk about. So the ones that we're allowed to talk about are Kixeye, who also have a studio here in Brisbane. They work on Vega Conflict. Telltale Games, which I'm sure most of you have heard of, obviously, Glue, and Intel. So it's been a really good experience for us. So, a little bit about Portland. So as I mentioned, we're from Portland, Oregon, and I don't know how many of you have been to Portland. It's like if Seattle and San Francisco had like a demented baby, that would be Portland. As you can see, the guy up there, the Darth Vader riding the unicycle, wearing a kilt and blowing bagpipes with flames. That guy's the Unipiper. Like, I see him all the time. Like, this is not like an unusual thing. So our motto is keep Portland weird, and it is a great place to live. We've got the great food and the booze and the good coffee, which I know is really important to you guys. But the one thing that we don't have is we don't really have much of a games industry. So the industry that we have, we create ourselves, and we have to make it work as businesses. It's that, or we move to California or Washington, or we just quit games. So because of that, I got involved in the Oregon Games Organization. So our job at OGO is to figure out how we can put some infrastructure in place to try to help companies like ours grow, or to maybe attract larger studios into opening offices in our state. And to my understanding, it's pretty similar to a group that you have here called Creative Victoria, who I believe are responsible for putting on this event. And so about a year ago, I was in town on some other business, and I got to meet some of the Creative Victoria people, and they shared with me some of the programs and infrastructure and support systems they have in place here in Melbourne. And I was really excited to come back and share that with OGO, because we're a little behind you guys, I think. But one of the things they also talked about was Games Week. And they said, oh, it's so crappy that you're not going to be here for Games Week. So when the opportunity to submit a talk for this year's GCAP came up, I thought, oh, this is so great. I totally want to do that. But it's my job within my company to be like the responsible adult. So I'm the business-facing person. So I'm the person who manages all the projects, whether it's internal or for clients. I'm the one who signs all the contract work. I do platform relations. I run payroll. I do anything and everything that's necessary. So there's never a good time for me to be away. And this was definitely no exception. We had a lot of deadlines and it just wasn't ideal. But then I saw what the theme of the event was, which was on the shoulders of giants. And that's when I knew I got to find a way to make this happen. I really want to submit a talk. Because that resonated with me in a very personal way. Because to an extent, that kind of sums up how my team and I all started our respective careers. Pardon me. So before we moved to Portland and started hanging out with the Unipiper, we were all San Francisco Bay Area AAA people. So these are just a couple of the companies that we all worked for and a couple of the products. I couldn't really fit them all on one slide. So we're a pretty experienced team. And when you come from that AAA background, it really is like being on the shoulder of a giant because you've got giant budgets and glorious infrastructure. Like you have marketing teams and PR teams and legal teams and HR teams, and you've got free food all the time, and you've got a QA department. You've got everything you could possibly need to be successful. But when you become an indie, the view of the world looks a little bit different. And it's a little scarier because we're constantly confronted with having to pick up things that we don't know how to do. Especially, again, when you come from that big AAA background where you're used to having people who are knowledgeable in all these areas helping you out. And suddenly, when you're an indie, you don't have any of that, and the world can seem very scary. So as indies, we have more than our fair share of obstacles, and as painful as it is when we confront them, they do serve a purpose in our lives, and that's to push us to be better and show us what we're made of. So in my capacity at OGO, and also probably because I travel around and give talks, I end up meeting a lot of indies who ask for mentoring. And so in doing so, I've found that a number of themes keep coming up over and over again. A number of common obstacles seem to be emerging that a lot of different indies face. So I want to talk about 3 of those today, and apparently I like to alliterate because they worked out as people in process, project management, and payment, AKA how do we actually pay ourselves. So let's start off with people in process. Unless you're a hobbyist who's making games for the sheer joy of doing it and releasing them into the wild to watch them be free and be enjoyed by others, you probably have some expectation of revenue, and that's a good thing. So in doing so, in making a game that you're actually selling for money, you are in effect creating a business. So that's the definition of a business. You've created goods that you're selling for money. But so many of us fail to look at it that way, and I think there's a really good reason for that. Starting anything new is incredibly stressful. I've been a career producer my entire adult life, and I still find the beginning of a project to be enormously stressful. But starting a new company and a new project at the same time is soul-crushing. It's incredibly challenging. And as human beings, when we're under stress, we tend to fall back on the things that we know. So as developers, we all know how to make games and we know how to build teams. I have no doubt that anyone in this room knows how to make a great game. But when we focus all of our efforts on making a great game instead of building a solid foundation on our business, we run the risk of making some assumptions that are maybe not correct. And in my experience, the most common of which is, dude, we are totally all on the same page. Now, we've got this. We are there. And the thing about that is, it's easy to assume that, but it's hard to know for certain that everyone's on the same page unless you have some explicit and very uncomfortable conversations that ensure that you are. And when you're starting something new, there's like a fragility to it, right? It feels very fragile and delicate, and so it's tempting to want to say, I don't want to talk about these uncomfortable subjects because maybe this thing will break apart in the face of a bunch of arguments. And honestly, we learned this lesson, quite frankly, the hard way. So we started out with 5 people on our team. And we had all worked together for 3 years as part of we worked at the only paying game job at the time in Portland, which was a satellite office to a San Francisco company. And there were 5 of us. We'd worked together for 3 years. We all got along very well. We all worked very similarly, and that's why we decided to break apart and become an indie studio. But in the context of being an indie, one of the guys really, we found out very early on, he was totally on a different page than us. He wanted to make different kinds of games. He wanted to work very differently than the rest of us. He wanted his role to be something in relationship to the rest of us. He wanted to be very different. And it was fundamentally incompatible with the other 4 of us. And so we were very lucky because we figured that out kind of by accident within the first 2 weeks. So we hadn't actually made anything, so things had not gotten messy. But the longer you go into partnership without some shared understanding of what you're all trying to achieve, things can get messy if things start to fall apart. So in its most basic form, when you create a business entity with partners, this is going to sound weird, but you're essentially creating a business marriage. You are legally bound to a bunch of other people until you decide you no longer want to be in that relationship. And when that happens, it's like a divorce. You have community property. You've got equipment that you've bought together. You have children in the form of your game. So who gets custody of the children? It can become very messy. So there is a really good solution to this, and that is the operating agreement. So operating agreements are really great because it forces uncomfortable conversations to happen up front, and it ensures that everyone in the team is on the same page. And it also makes provisions for the event of both failure and success. So essentially, it holds everybody accountable to a mutual understanding. So I want to go through and talk about a couple of the questions that you actually will answer when you start looking at creating an operating agreement. So first one is, what is the initial investment of each team member? Is it money? Is it time? Is it money and time? And if so, what is the value of everyone's contribution, and how does that translate into ownership? Are you equal partners? Has somebody contributed a bunch of money? So does that make them more of a partner? Do they actually get more equity than you do? So distribution of profit and losses. This sounds straightforward, but it has potential to get a little strange. So let's say you have 4 people and you make a product that nets you $400,000, because I like very basic math here. So you might have one person that wants to take all of it because he's a partner, he's legally entitled to. But 3 of you might want to take $50,000 each and invest $50,000 into the business, into the next product. So that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have in the moment when you have $400,000 in the bank and suddenly someone wants more than you feel like is good for the business. So another big question is, what outside activities are permitted? So if I work for your company, am I allowed to do contract work with another company? Can I have a full-time job and work for the company? Again, it's really important to work that out because sometimes there can be conflict of interests that happens that is a little tricky. So another one is, how do we handle it if someone wants to leave before or after the end of a project? So let's say I work on your project, I get halfway to the end of the first game, and I decide, I don't want to do this anymore, I can't afford it, and I want to leave. I've still contributed, let's say, several months of my time. That actually does have value. But should I participate equally in the profit of the game because I've left in the middle? Or let's say I do finish the product with you, and I decide I don't want to do another one, the rest of you want to stay on. Because I've been a partner, am I entitled to have profits from the next game even though I'm not going to participate? So again, really important to have these conversations up front. So what are your expectations of work time versus time off? And this is another one that gets super weird and squirrely. Because when you have your own business, it's easy to fall into this idea of like, dude, I have my own business. I can come and go when I want. It is fantastic. And then you've got the other camp that's like, dude, I'm shackled to my desk all the time because I own my own business. In fact, not long ago, there was a 3-day weekend and someone was asking me, oh, do you get such and such off? I'm like, oh, you kid, that's so funny. Like I get days off. So, you know, if you have that fundamental incompatibility with the amount of investment of time every partner is going to have, really better to figure that out up front. So again, what do you do if someone's not pulling their weight? And again, this is a really, really tricky one, because if you have a partner who's not pulling their weight and you don't have some provisions to address that, you can get in serious trouble, because technically they are a legal partner, so they do have some ownership whether they're performing or not. So these are all really important things to talk about up front. And if you are in a team and you don't have an operating agreement, it's not the end of the world. You can still make one now. You can make an operating agreement at any time. And in fact, my team and I have had an operating agreement for some time, and we're redoing it again because our business has changed a little bit. And so it's important to reevaluate some of the decisions that you've made early on. So with all of that said, even if you have an operating agreement, oh, there's one more thing I left on there, and I think I skipped right past it. The last question on there is, who gets to make the big important decisions? By big important decisions, what I'm talking about here are things like, who can legally bind you to a contract? So you can't have two partners maybe signing on to different contracts that have a conflict of interest. So who actually can legally bind you to a contract? Who can go to a bank and take out a loan on behalf of your company? Things like that. So again, very important to have all of that up front so you don't have any weird legal situations that arise. However, all of that said, even if you have an operating agreement, there are still some weird situations that you can find yourself in, especially around issues of day-to-day decision making. So again, this is not the big decisions. This is the hundreds of decisions that we all make on a daily basis, because that's what life is when you run a game studio. And this can be especially tricky when you have equal partners that happen to be in even numbers, like you don't have that tiebreaker. And that's really common amongst a lot of indies. A lot of us do have pretty equal partnership structures. So for my team, coming from a corporate studio system, there was always a lot of structure and hierarchy, which meant there's always people above you making decisions about your lives over which you have no control. So when we started being an indie studio, one of the things that was really appealing to us was we thought, oh, this is fantastic. We're totally going to have control over our own destiny. That sounds so good to us right now. But that manifested for us in kind of a kooky way, because for us, having control over our destiny ended up meaning that we all wanted to weigh in on every single decision that was made, like every single decision. So that inherently put us into this consensus-based decision-making model. And I think consensus can be really good, but it also has its drawbacks. Especially again, if you have, like us, we have 4 people. And so I find that, at least in the beginning, whenever we would talk about anything, it could be big, like, what's our next game gonna be? Or it could be small, like, where should we go to lunch? We'd immediately break up into teams of 2 versus 2 and we'd start duking it out. So that was not productive, and it led to a lot of challenges in a poor little chomp. So early on, we had a pretty deep philosophical divide about what we thought the game should be. And again, it's 2 versus 2. So 2 of us felt like the game was shaping up to be a pretty challenging platformer that was aimed at teens and adults. And our other 2 partners, they had kids, and so they're like, well, that's nice, but we should have some kid-friendly features and give it a kid-friendly look and feel. And we went back and forth on this quite a bit. And eventually, they sort of wore us down. And their logic seemed plausible, because we hadn't quite figured out the marketing component of being an indie at that point. And their argument was, hey, if we make a game that appeals to kids and adults, we'll have a broader audience, and it'll be awesome. And what we quickly learned is when you make a game for everybody, you make a game for nobody. And that was the one common thread that ran through all of our reviews. Like, hey, Little Chomp, it's a great game. It's super challenging, way too challenging for kids, but the adults might not want to look at it because they'll think it's a kid's game. So again, super expensive lesson, but we did actually learn something really valuable from it. And that is this idea of role clarity. So after Little Chomp, we realized that the whole consensus thing was killing us. So from that point forward, we went through the process of figuring out who the decision maker was going to be for absolutely every discussion we were having. And within our company, there is no one decision maker. Like I'm, I guess, what you would call here the managing director, but I don't make all the decisions because it would make zero sense for me to make decisions about technology. That's not my expertise. Nor would it make sense for our CTO to be making business decisions. It would not make sense for any of us to be making decisions about game design. We can all have opinions, but the final word has to come from the designer because he's the one with the expertise. So that also doesn't mean that we don't have to talk to each other because that would be weird and dysfunctional too. But what it does mean is that at the end of the day, we all have our say, and the person who gets to decide can say, I hear you, I don't agree, we're going this way, and we have to support that decision. So Intel kind of takes this a step further, and they do something really interesting. They provide a framework for these kinds of discussions called disagree and commit, and I find this fascinating. So let's say you've got a bunch of people at Intel sitting around the table, and they're discussing option A or option B, and you've got one decider. So everybody makes their passionate arguments, and the decider says, all right, I think we're going with option A. So they take this extra step at that point, and they go back around the table, and every single person at the table has to say, okay, I agree, or I disagree and commit. And what that does is it adds this layer of accountability to everybody. Because as we all know, if you secretly disagree with something, you can find a way to tank it. So everybody is responsible for making that decision a success. And if that decision tanks, despite everyone's best efforts, then the person who decided is accountable. So there's that level of accountability that really holds everyone's feet to the fire, and I think that's a really cool way to approach it. So let's move on to the next one, project management. So project management seems to be pretty underrepresented within the indie community. And there is a very good reason for that. When you look at most indie studios, they're divided up into, it's like engineers, artists, and designers. Because realistically, you can't make a game without those three roles. You can make a game without a producer or a project manager. It's just going to be a little more painful and a little less efficient. But because I do a lot of mentoring, and there are so few indie teams that seem to have dedicated project management, this is an area that I get asked for help on a lot. So whenever I'm working with a team and I'm doing like a project management boot camp, one of the first lessons that we go over is one that I learned right out of the gate when I got my first producing job. And it goes a little something like this. Money, time, features. Pick two. It's as simple as that. There is always going to be a trade-off no matter what you do. So do you want it fast and cheap? Then it's going to be at the sacrifice of quality and features. Do you want it fast and high quality? Then you're going to have to throw a bunch of bodies at it, and it's going to be really expensive. But if you want something high quality and you're not worried about time, you can put fewer people on, maybe part-time, and eventually you'll get to something beautiful, and it'll cost you less money. But again, there is always, always a trade-off. And for us as indies, that trade-off is almost always money. So I want to talk about that quite a bit today. Unless you're in AAA, money is always going to be the limiting factor for us. And even when you're doing contract work, budget is still a limiting factor. Like I have yet to ever have a client come up and say, come and work with us, and money is no object. Like I long to live in that world. That would be a beautiful world to live in, but I just have never been in that circumstance, at least yet. So because we're always constrained by financial issues, that puts some extra onus on us to figure that out early on. And once you do, then the budget and the schedule kind of tends to fall out pretty easily. And yet, this is honestly easier said than done. So last year at GDC, I was kind of bunkered down in my hotel room because I had 2 talks on the same day. And I barely left my hotel room, but it seemed like every time I did, I'd run into people I knew, and we'd end up talking about projects, and the subject of budget would come up, and they'd be like, dude, I totally don't have a budget. I just can't even think about that right now. I'll figure it out when I get there. And that to me just seemed crazy. It'd be like flying a plane in really bad weather without instrumentation. Like, how are you gonna land, safely without knowing where you are at any given point? And so I had so many of these conversations. I was invited to speak in the Indie the Indie Soapbox rant. So at the last minute, I changed my rant to this very politically correct statement. Make a fucking budget, for fuck's sake. I will admit, there was a box of wine involved in the theme of this. It was Australian Shiraz, so there is that. But I started off with this fine flow chart, so if you yourselves are concerned about whether or not you need a budget, this might help you out a little. Are you alive? Do you need money for living? You need a fucking budget. So whether you realize it or not, or whether you have one or not, you definitely need a budget. So let's talk a little bit about those, why we avoid them, some common mistakes we make as indies, and why you need one. So let's talk about why we're budget averse. There are a whole bunch of reasons that I've heard people talk about over the years. And the first one that you hear most is, I don't have a budget because I don't think I need one. And I kind of get this because I fell into this a little bit on our first game, because having a budget implies you have actual money to spend, right? So if you have no money, you're like, why do I need a budget if I don't have any money? All I have is time. Which brings us to our next point. We don't always know how to value our time, and that is so hard. We'll come back to that in a minute, but that's legitimately hard. So we believe that focusing on money devalues our art. This may not be a thing here. You might be more sensible. I will say in Portland, we have a lot of artisan developers who feel a little gross about trying to make money from their art, and they feel like it devalues it by doing what they have to do to make money. And again, that kind of goes back to that hobbyist thing. I think if you feel that way, you have to decide, am I a hobbyist and I'm doing this just for the sheer love of doing it? Because if not, I got to get over myself and figure out how I'm going to make some money and recuperate my investment of time. And then the last one, and I think kind of the most painful one, is it forces us to look at things that we just might not want to look at. Like how much money we really need to finish our products, or how much we stand to lose on our investment. So this is a fun one for me. So I very rarely share revenue information, but I'm going to make an exception in this case, because often in the world of mobile, certainly, when people share their revenues, it's because they've killed it. They're doing incredibly well, and they're like, yes, I nailed it. I'm totally rich. So very few people are super excited to go, wow, I completely ate shit on that game. This is terrible. Look at how badly I did. But I'm going to kind of throw myself on that grenade because I think there's some really interesting lessons in there. So get ready for it. Our total revenue on Little Chump, a whopping $10,000. So a little over 10,000, but we're going to keep the numbers round because not as good as math as probably a lot of you. Total revenue per partner, because there was 4 of us at the time, $2,500, the big 2,500. Our total development hours were 6,400 hours. So that's 4 people times 40 hours times 10 months. And it was actually more than 40 hours, but I could only bear to put 6,400 hours. I couldn't stand it anymore. So that breaks down, total per person, 1,600 hours. So, all right, get ready. The ugly maths. Note, I used maths instead of math because we're in Australia, and that's what you guys do. So $2,500 divided by 1,600 hours is Get ready for my suffering, laugh at my suffering. $1.56 per hour.
I'm so sorry.
Thank you. Thank you. So incredibly shitty. So out of a perverse sense of curiosity, I went back and I Googled, what is the minimum wage in Oregon in 2012? And it was $8.80 per hour. So essentially, we made $7.24 less an hour than we would have if we'd worked at Starbucks. In fact, we would have made more because they get tips. So that is just tragic. You had 4 people who have 10 to 15 years of AAA experience, and we were making $1.56 per hour. And that's actually why it's really important to look at these things, because you really start to realize, wow, if I'm not efficient with my time and I don't make the money that I hope to make, this is not tenable. This isn't doable. You're taking a picture of my suffering, aren't you? So, couple things about budgets. Budgets cover more than your external costs. And I know that seems really obvious, but I feel the need to say it because I ran into a friend of mine at GDC again, and she and her husband were talking about how they broke even. And they made $5,000 and they worked on the project for 3 years, and her husband worked on it full time. And I'm like, they were saying, well, we paid our contractors back, so we're breaking even. And I'm like, do you not think that if you worked for 3 years, you'd make more than $5,000 and you'd probably be able to keep it? So that is a common trap that indies do fall into. Another one is the biggest part of your budget is actually your own time, as we talked about earlier. And that means you have to actually figure out what your time is worth. And it's hard, but we have to do it because our time has value. So we need to treat it like it's actually worth something. If you made an amazing game for a company, a big game company, they'd actually pay you money, and a lot of it. So you need to quantify what the value is of your time and put it into your own budget. And what that does is it not only helps you make a budget, obviously, but it makes you more respectful of your own time, and it really does make you more acutely aware of your efficiency. So we've all heard the phrase, time is money. And you will never feel that more acutely than when you realize, oh my God, it's my own time and money that I'm actually wasting. So I'm not sure there's any one formula for figuring out what a budget is. It's really more like asking yourself a series of questions. And if any of you are really struggling with what your hourly rate is and you want to make a budget, just reach out to me afterward. I'd be happy to talk things through with you. But essentially, you need to answer a lot of these questions. How much money do I need as an individual? How much money does my company need? Because your company is not just, paying you. You have taxes to pay, and you have overhead costs, and you have equipment to buy, and all that sort of stuff. So you need to factor that in as well. And of course, you have to ask yourself, how much money could I be making if I had a day job with a steady paycheck? In other words, what's my relative value of my skill set? When I'm actually putting together a budget for contract work, that's the only thing that I care about. I'm always going to go on the high end of a budget when I'm dealing with clients because there's no potential back end there. You are exchanging time for money, and that's it. Now, obviously, when you're creating your own games, there is some potential value there on the back end. So you might want to kind of go with the lower end. You can either go with how much money do I need to make, to survive, or you can go a little above that. Okay, I don't necessarily want to go rock bottom. I want to aim for somewhere in between the top end and the bottom. Also ask yourself, how much money do I need to complete the product? How long is it going to take? What additional resources do I need that I don't actually have? And how much money can I make from my product? And that's kind of a weird one because honestly, it's really hard to tell, and I'll come to that in a minute. And how much money do I have available right now? So once you've answered all these questions, it's going to go a long way towards helping you get a picture of your company's financial health and of your budgets for your own projects. But what happens when you just don't have enough money available to make the product you want to make? Or worse still, you invest a bunch of money, like we did, in a game that doesn't pan out. So what do you do then? This comes to obstacle number 3, which is payment. In other words, How do we pay ourselves? So what do we do to keep our teams together when things don't go to plan? Because quite honestly, more often than not, they don't. No matter what platform you're actually developing for, with the possible exception of VR, all platforms are overcrowded, which means discoverability is a huge problem for all of us. And we're not only competing with each other for discoverability, we're competing with the giants we talked about earlier. And a lot of times, success is completely outside of your control. So for example, I have a team I work with, and they got amazing, heartbreakingly incredible mainstream press for their game. They had a really kooky, weird game, and they just got a lot of press attention. And so they thought, oh, great, we're rolling in it. And they didn't get featured by Apple, so they made pretty much nothing. And that press didn't translate into any kind of actual monetary gains. So these days, you can make the greatest game, you can make it quickly, as efficiently as possible, and you still might run into problems. So what do you do at that point? So back in the 40s, Abraham Maslow published a paper called The Theory of Human Motivation in Psychological Review, in which he established the hierarchy of needs. So I'm sure you guys have seen this, right? The Maslow's hierarchy of needs, little pyramid. And the idea here is that at the top of the pyramid, you have creativity and self-actualization. And you have to meet all these different layers of needs along the way in order to achieve that. So at the lowest level of the pyramid, you have the physiological needs like food, shelter, breathing, sleeping, all the stuff you need to just keep this baby humming. But then you have above that safety and security. So that's like health, employment, property, family, social stability. And it's kind of funny that money plays a rather large role in some of those foundational human needs. Sadly, I wish it weren't true, but it can be. So I got to tell you from my own experience, not only doing individual personal projects, but also team projects, it's really hard to be creative when you are constantly shitting yourself, to be frank, about, oh my God, how am I going to live? I'm running out of money. I don't know how much longer I can do this. That's a tape that plays in your head constantly. And it really does get in the way of creativity. So for us, there was a pretty obvious solution. And that ended up being work for hire. So I want to be clear here. When I say work for hire, I'm not talking about all of you go your separate ways as individual consultants, because I think if you do that, your days as a studio are probably numbered, because it's very unlikely that you'll all suddenly be free at the same time to start working on a project. So what I'm talking about here is offering yourself up as a team of consultants, which is kind of an interesting paradigm shift, and there are some interesting nuances to doing that. So people where I'm from, again, Portland, Oregon, a lot of artisan people, there are a lot of different opinions about this. And there are definitely some people that are like, you're totally selling out if you do contract work. That's so uncool. And going back to my original point, I think obstacles are there for a reason. And when you hit a financial wall, really, whether it's cool or uncool, it doesn't matter. You've got two choices. You give up or you live to fight another day. And in my view, there's absolutely no dishonor in doing what you have to do to keep your team together so you can live to fight another day. So all that said, there are, again, some nuances between being an individual consultant and a team, consulting as a team. So this is not only my own experience, but when we were making this transition, we spent some time talking to other studios who had been doing this for a while, and they were very generous and shared some information with us. So fundamentally, the difference between being an individual consultant is you're usually priced hourly, meaning if you work 38 hours a week, you get paid for 38 hours a week. And you tend to be able to charge a little bit more. You're judged as an individual contributor, and you tend to work on site, and often you're managed by the team that you're working for. They have project managers. You will be kind of sucked into the board, to use a really old phrase, and that's pretty much how that goes. When you're doing team consulting, you're often priced out at man months. So, for example, if you work 38 hours a week, if you're super efficient, you're being contracted for 40 hours a week. The flip side of that is if you have to work 45 hours a week, you're being paid for 40 hours a week. So it really does force you to be more efficient. So because your time is being bought in bulk, rates tend to be lower. Your contribution is judged at the team level. And by that I mean you often have a lot more autonomy as a contract team. Often you are being either given a project until go off and come back and make this work, or you're given a piece of a project where they'll say, okay, this is broken, you guys fix it, come back to me when it's ready. Which essentially means that you need to have a project manager on your team. And I know, if you're not excited to have a project manager, this is the time to think about it. So we are up in Portland, Oregon, and as I said, there's not a lot of games industry, so most of our clients are in other parts of the country. So every time I approach a new client, we go through the same dance of, we want you to work on site. And a lot of people on my team now have little kids, so they're like, I can't leave my family and work on site for months at a time with no end in sight. And so we go through this dance of trying to convince them that we don't actually need to be on site to do your work correctly. And one of the reasons why I think most people want a contract team on site is that they're kind of scared that they're going to lose control, or they're not going to know what's going on, or the team is going to miss out on vital information and waste their time. So it's your job, if you're managing an indie studio and you're trying to sell this kind of work, to convince them, no, in fact, the onus will be entirely on me to make this project smooth and successful. If it's not, then you can come and tell me and we'll figure it out, but I will do whatever it takes to make this project work. And so again, that's a project management role, because that takes a lot of extra work on your part when you're working on a remote project. And if you're an engineer, you need to be working on engineering. You don't need to be figuring out, is everybody going to be on time for this 8 o'clock call? And what are they going to talk about? And it's going to have any relevance to me. You need to let someone else do that and focus on the work that you're good at. Okay. So when you're marketing yourself as a team of consultants, there are a couple of things that you might want to consider. First and foremost is, you got to be really clear and honest about your team's strengths and weaknesses. Now, by that, I don't mean, going to your client saying, everybody on my team is great except Larry's kind of a slacker, but I'll work on it. You don't want to have that kind of conversation. But you have to be really clear amongst yourself and your team, where are the areas where we demonstrably shine, and go after projects that are looking for that kind of team. So, along those lines, it's definitely better to go after jobs that play to your team's strengths. So when you're a contract studio, your reputation is pretty much everything. And a lot of our work, I have to say, we've been really lucky. So we'll work with one client and we'll get to know people on that team, and then they'll quit and go off to other companies, and then they'll be like, hey, we need someone like you. So making sure that you're maintaining a really good reputation is important, and that means not getting in over your head. So if, for example, you have a team that's got amazing artists, but you've got kind of junior engineers, you want to not go after those really complex engineering projects unless you know you can bring in some resources that will help you shore that up. Have a clear story about what makes you the right choice for the client. So very similarly to how we market our games, like we have to have, when we're talking to press, we need to have some story of like, here's why this game is better than the millions of other games out there, and here's why you should play it. You have to do that for your team as well. So you have to have your kind of hero's journey. So in the case of our team, the way I often pitch us, for example, is I describe us to clients as we're like a Navy SEAL team. Like, you give us a backpack, a Bowie knife, a power bar, and a parachute. You push us out of the plane and yell, go kill your way out of there, soldier, and that's what we do. That's pretty much the kinds of projects that we often get, are projects where there's tight turns, high stakes, crazy technical challenges. And so because of that, I can charge more money. But if for some reason I lost some of my more senior engineers, then I'd have to change that story to reflect the team that I actually have. So the other thing is price yourself according to your team's experience level. Now, this is a funny one because it's really tempting to go, I want to make as much money as I possibly can. But I can tell you from my experience, being at the higher end of that has its drawbacks. So a couple years ago, I was on a panel with some other indies. We were talking about business issues like this. And there was another studio head. She was another woman, and we were talking about pricing and sharing information to help each other out. And in her case, she had a really bright, talented team, but they were pretty fresh out of college. They were within 2 years of being out of college. So they were incredibly talented, really good at what they did, but a lot less experienced. So she can charge, she charges less money than I do. But if she and I went for the same job, all things being equal, she'd kill me every time. However, if it was a job requiring heavy technical skills and abilities, then I would probably beat her despite my higher price point. And the last thing is, of course, put yourself out there as much as possible, doing things like this, going to conferences, meeting people, talking to people openly about the fact that you're wanting to make this transition. It's been amazing to me when we decided that we were going to make this transition. We started as simply as I flew down to San Francisco and met with some friends and said, this is what we want to do. Can you help us? And they really went out of their way to help us, hook us up with people, and get us started. So that is a very important part of all of this. So all of that said, I wanted to open up the floor to some questions because I've probably blabbed long enough. So does anybody have anything they want to ask?
Making your own projects first or trying to find some experience by doing one part?
That's a good question. So if you didn't hear that, the question was, if you have a somewhat experienced team and you want to get into consulting, should you do your own project first or should you try to do some other work for hire? And the answer would be definitely try to do your own project first. And the one thing that Little Chomp really did for us is it was an excellent calling card. It was high quality. We actually, funnily enough, with Little Chomp, this is a funny thing. We developed our own game engine for Little Chomp, and one of our consulting gigs, I was able to convince the client that they should license our game engine for a huge amount of money. So Little Chomp actually did pay for itself, but in a super weird way. So in the process of doing your own games, if you look at areas that you're struggling in your own development, and maybe you create some pipeline tools that help facilitate game development, that is a total selling point that you can use with clients. Hey, we struggled with this and we created this and we'll let you use it. So yeah, it's a great question.
In regards to budgets, you obviously mentioned, say I'm studying a company with a budget to start with. As we go along, obviously we're going to be paying people. How frequently and what kind of tools and processes do you use to monitor the budget as you continue through your development cycle?
Oh, that's a great question. So I almost put in a tweet that someone, the question is, how do you monitor your budget and kind of the health of your project as you go along? Is that right? So one thing we do now religiously, and my whole team is like, oh, dude, I hate it so much, is timesheets. And someone actually tweeted something a while ago. It's like I'm lying in my grave. The project manager comes up to me and whispered, "You forgot to submit your timesheet." And I'm like, that is totally me. I would totally do that. In fact, actually, I was sitting in the speaker lounge going, "You guys need to submit your timesheets because it's the end of the month and I need to do billing when I go home tonight." So timesheets are really, really important. For a whole host of reasons. One, it helps you to understand how much of your time you're spending. Like that 6,400 hours that I mentioned, it was probably a lot more than that. And we probably made negative money at that point, or 2 cents an hour, or something like that. But it is really important to see where you're hemorrhaging time. It's also really important to monitor burnout. So if somebody is putting in huge amounts of hours, I can look at that and say, dude, you need to go take some days off. Like, this is not sustainable. Another thing timesheets does, and I almost talked about this, but I kind of ran out of time, is it helps you to understand where somebody is potentially having a weird issue that's hard to see. So, for example, at one point, one of our designers was spending a lot of time on something really weird. Like, I saw this in his timesheets. He's like, I'm working on particle effects. And he was really behind in his level design. And I'm like, dude, what the hell are you doing with all the particle effects? We're not ready for that yet. Why are you so behind? And in talking to him and having that discussion, I realized that he was absolutely paralyzed with self-doubt. It just laid him out. Because making a game involves a lot of big, overwhelming problems to solve. And sometimes when you see someone focusing on a really small, stupid problem, you're like, oh, their brain is overloading and they can't deal with that. So I need to figure out how to get him past this and build up his confidence so he can let go of that and start focusing on the things that he needs to do. So timesheets are really good. They're sucky for everybody on your team and they'll hate your guts, but they are actually really good. Anybody have any other questions?
With a lot of indie teams wearing a lot of different hats at the same time, you mentioned before about having focus on a particular area. As a project manager or producer, do you tend to be like, you should stay project manager or you should stay producer and not like also the level design or also sound design?
Well, that's what I was talking about. Like, so many people have to try and wear the multiple hats. And it is really hard, especially because the thing that you're not comfortable with is the thing that you're going to give the least amount of attention, or it's going to be the thing that causes you the most pain. So if at all possible, like, a lot of people think it's super luxurious that I'm a producer on an indie team, but I have to say, like, I bring in a lot of money. Without me, I don't think anybody on my team would disagree. I'm the person who brings in the contracts. I'm the person who got us in front of Apple. So you might think you can't afford a producer, but you might find that actually they might pay for themselves. Because on a project where we're consulting, I bill alongside everyone else. In fact, I'm the highest biller in the company, which is kind of funny because when we have multiple projects going, I'm involved in all of them, so I bill on all of them. So it'd be worth thinking about, and if that's something you want to talk about afterward, I can help you kind of try and figure that out. Anybody else? Nothing? Okay. Well, thanks, you guys. This was really fun. I appreciate you having me.